Good morning, church. It's nice to see you all this morning. As I was preparing on Friday, I was preparing to take you through Acts chapter 3. And if you've read your bulletins, you'll see the key text there. But halfway through Friday, I decided to change. And so we're not actually going to have that as our key text. But it's interesting that the title that I chose on Wednesday still fitted where I believe that God was taking us today. As you know, the last few times that I've spoken to you guys, we've been looking at the life of Peter. And we looked at the life of Peter with Jesus, and then we looked at the life of Peter after Jesus. And we saw that there was two distinct differences between the life of Peter while Jesus was on this earth and the life of Peter after Jesus had left this earth. And we found a really strange phenomenon that the better Peter came later, not before. Who found that interesting? Yeah, it doesn't seem to fit, does it? And we looked at three reasons why that might be. Do you remember what they were? He had someone praying for him. He got a greater picture of who Jesus was, and also he was filled with the Holy Spirit. And last time I spoke to you, we spoke about the Holy Spirit and the impact that that had on Peter's life, and that he stood up and was able to keep standing. He was a changed man, but he was a changed man from those three aspects. So where I want to take us today is what we only just touched on before, and that's Peter getting a greater picture of who God is. So that's what we're going to go through today, and we're going to see that yes, he was blind while he was still seeing. He was blind while he was still seeing. And how does that relate to communion? You know, I want us to think today about sometimes how we might have come to this service, how we might have come in the past, how we might have even come today. We might not have realised that communion was on, and I wonder what we think of this service. Certainly to me it was like, I don't want to be involved in foot washing, that's not comfortable for me, and I really didn't realise the significance of this whole package that Jesus had put in place for us to remember his love for us. And that's the way I want us to look at this morning, that this is a picture of Jesus' love for you and for me. And when Peter got an understanding of that, it changed and reordered his life. So let's have a look at a passage where Peter was not understanding. And this is where Jesus was about to wash Peter's feet. In John chapter 13, John chapter 13, and I'm only going to look at verses 5 and 6. 5 and 6. John chapter 13, verse 5. After that he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet and to wipe them with a towel in which he was girded. This is Jesus doing this service because no one else was prepared to do it. No one else was prepared to lower themselves to the point where they could wash others' feet. And we find that Jesus was doing that. And in verse 6 it says, he came to Simon Peter and he said to him, Lord, are you washing my feet? This is like one of those rhetorical questions, like, no way this is going to happen. I can't have you, the King of the universe, wash my feet. I should have been washing yours, but you shouldn't be washing mine. And Jesus says, what I am doing now you do not understand, but after this you will know. So in other words, Peter was having his feet washed because he finally agreed, but he didn't understand why, or he didn't understand what it was about this process. In this chapter we find that we're introduced to Judas beforehand, and later on Jesus was telling his disciples that someone is going to betray me. And Peter leaned over to John and said, ask him who it is. He was really keen to know who it was. He wanted to make sure it wasn't himself. And then later on, Jesus actually tells Peter that you are going to do what? Betray me. Yeah. And when we look at this whole process, we see that Jesus really, before Peter does the betraying, that Jesus is actually setting things up for Peter's restoration. I don't know if you've ever thought about it like that, but I thought about it yesterday, that before this event even took place, Jesus wanted to know that through this process of having his feet washed, he could be restored. So Jesus said that he was going to do this. How did he go with that? Let's go over to Luke chapter 22. Luke chapter 22. And in the same passage it tells us in Luke 22, in verse 31, and the Lord said, Simon, Simon, indeed Satan has asked that he may sift you as wheat, but I have prayed for you, that your faith should not fail, and when you have returned to me, strengthen your brethren. We looked at this passage a little while ago, and we saw that this returning was when he was fully converted. He wasn't fully converted. He wasn't seeing clearly. And then in verse 34, he tells him that, like Peter tells Jesus, that he's ready to go to prison and even to death. And Jesus says to Peter, I tell you, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. 3 times. So in verse 56, we have this servant girl come to him, and he says, I didn't know him. Later on, another one came, and he said, I didn't know him. And then after that, in verse 59, after about an hour had passed, another confidently affirmed, saying, surely this fellow was also with him, for he is a Galilean. But Peter said, man, I do not know what you are saying. Immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. That was his wake-up call. And when the rooster crowed, he realised what he had done. And it tells us in verse 61 that the Lord turned and looked at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Wow. What was going through Peter's mind? How did he cope with this event? Jesus had already foretold what he was going to do. He thought he was pretty good. He thought he'd go to his death to protect Jesus. But just the simple thing of actually not wanting to be associated with Jesus, he had done this to Jesus. We find in verse 62, so Peter went out and wept bitterly. Peter went out and wept bitterly. How upset was Peter? He was devastated. He was devastated that when Christ was in his most time of need, that he did this to Christ. We know that after that, Peter witnessed his death on the cross. And Jesus actually came and saw the disciples after that, and that he was risen, and Peter certainly knew about that. But what did this event do to Peter? I want to suggest to you that this event for Peter made him give up on what he was supposed to do. He felt unworthy. He felt that surely God can't use someone like me now. I've just blown it completely. I'm just absolutely had it. Why do I say that? Let's turn back over to the book of John, in John chapter 21. John chapter 21. In John chapter 21 and verse 3 it says, Simon Peter said to them, I am going fishing. And they said to him, "We're going with you also." And they went out immediately and got in the boat, and that night they caught nothing. What does this tell us about Peter? This actually tells us that Peter had lost his vision of what he was meant to be. He had let Christ down. He was no longer worthy to do what Christ was asking him to do, which was to be a fisher of men. What Christ wants each one of us to do. And Peter just said, "I'm going back fishing. I'm done." And a few other the disciples that were there said, "Yeah, look, we're coming with you. We're done with this role. We're just not good enough for this role. We better go." And so they went out and they fished all night and caught nothing. I wonder what was going through Peter's mind that night. I'd love to know. I wish it was recorded about what was going through his mind, because I can just imagine. I can imagine that he was thinking of another night when he went out and he fished all night and caught nothing. And that was the time that Jesus called him to be a fisher of men. And here he is at this point in his life, and he's gone back to fishing. He's gone out in his boat, and he's come home with absolutely nothing. So in the morning, what happens? In the morning, as they're coming in, got nothing to show for their whole night of fishing. That morning now came Jesus, in verse 4, stood on the shore, yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. I would have been pretty tired. Would not, have been in that mind frame to even know. And then in verse 5 it says, "Then Jesus said to them, 'Children, have you any food?' And they answered him, 'No.'" Anyone pick up on what Jesus' first words were? Children. Children. He was actually calling them his own. And now that Jesus had died and redeemed them, they can legally be called the children of God. And one of the first things Jesus says at this point, "Children, have you caught anything?" And then he says, "Cast out your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some." So they cast out, and now they were not able to draw it in because of the multitude of fish. Here we see now a greater parallel of Peter's first calling. Peter's first calling, he'd been out all night fishing. He came in, Jesus was using the boat to preach to the people. And when he'd finished preaching, he said to Peter, "Take out the boat a little bit and let out your nets." And what did Peter say? "It's a waste of time. We've been out all night, we've caught nothing, it's absolute waste of time." And yet they did it. They let down the nets. And when they let down the nets, they found that they'd caught such a catch that they needed the boat beside to come and help them with this catch. But here we find that there was no questions asked about whether to put it out, because I believe that Peter's probably thought back to that point of his very first call and realised how much he had upset Jesus and how unworthy he actually felt at this point of time. And what does Jesus do? He says, "Come in and have some breakfast with me." Jesus had supplied them with the catch. He already had fish there for them to feed on that morning for breakfast. We find that they ate with Jesus. And in verse 15 it tells us, "So when they had eaten breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, 'Simon, son of Jonah.'" Interesting that he's calling him son of Jonah, because that's now what he's gone back to. He didn't go back to his change of name where he was fishing. Now Jesus is calling him that because he went back to the place where he was in before Jesus called him to be a disciple and to follow him. "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these?" And he said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And he said to him, feed my lambs. Do you love me more than these? I wonder what the these were. Was that his friends that were around him? Or was that the fish? Or was that his whole experience of going back to where he was before? What do you love the most, Peter? Tell me what you love the most. And what does Peter say? You know that I love you, Lord. He said, feed my lambs. What is Jesus doing here? Jesus has shown him that he's already restored because of his love for Jesus. You know, I love this passage because Peter didn't feel that he could do this work anymore. He felt that he'd absolutely blown everything and was back out fishing. But Jesus says to him a second time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? And he answered, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him, tend my sheep. In verse 17, he said to him a third time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my sheep. Then later on, he says, follow me. Follow me. What was Jesus doing here? He was reminding Peter that even though he had forsaken him those 3 times in front of those other people, that he was restored. But what the interesting thing is, that the restoration that Jesus was offering Peter here wasn't determined by Christ's love for him. Ever thought of that before? Peter's restoration to work for God's kingdom wasn't determined by God's love for him. It was determined by Peter's love for Jesus. So 3 times Jesus made that really clear to Peter, because 3 times he had denied him. And now 3 times this restoration doesn't depend on God's love for Peter. It depends on Peter's love for God. How do we know it doesn't depend on God's love for Peter? Because Jesus had just died for him. He'd showed him the full extent of his love. You know, so often we have this picture of who God is, and certainly for me, for many years of my life, I was refrained from coming to God because I saw that I was not good enough for God to love. But what this shows is that our fitness for God and for his kingdom doesn't depend on God's love for us, but on our love for him. And Peter had to affirm that 3 times. And so with the foot washing, we see that Jesus foretold what Peter was going to do. He foretold and prepared him for this event, and he'd already put in place Peter's restoration. Peter didn't get it. Although seeing it all in front of him, he was still blind. But this was the final moment that turned him from that blindness to seeing. I pray that this event today for us, this going out and having our feet washed, realising that Jesus is our restorer and that we can take a part in helping restore others, may we come back in and see how much Jesus loved us when we partake of this bread and this wine. And may we show our love for him by being his followers. I invite you to go out to the respective places if you are here for the first time, and even if you don't want to be involved, you can go out and observe. We can go out through this door here and in the hall behind us. Married couples sometimes meet.